This is a video that I never thought that I would personally have to make, which is a video to basically say that you, when you're training your back, when you're doing pull downs, when you're doing rows, should use this thing. Now, that doesn't mean that you should use this thing in all exercises at all times. And by the way, this is a strap, for those of you who don't know, that you put around your wrist, that you wrap around an implement to make sure that you can hold on to it. And the reason I'm surprised that this is even a video is because it seems like somewhat of a silly conversation to have. There are people on one side of the coin who say you should pretty much use straps for every pulling motion all the time ever because they're so amazing. And on the other side of the coin, there are these people who are saying something like, well, if you need straps when you're doing pulling motions, that means your forearms are weak, right? And so what I want to focus on in this video are the benefits of straps, and specifically what they're useful for and when you might want to use them. I find that the claim that your forearms are weak if you can't hold on to something as you're doing, let's say, a pull down, I think it's just a kind of very low resolution idea, claim, and it makes no sense. For example, why wouldn't you say the same thing about a deadlift, right? Like you should only be able to double overhand grip your deadlift because if you can't, then your forearms are weak. It's like, who is determining weakness? Who gets to decide, right? It's kind of just a purely subjective thing. So rather than sort of being in the lane of just pure subjectivity, I'm going to describe the three major benefits of using straps when you are doing pulling motions. So the first and the most obvious, right, is you do not encounter, or at least in large part you eliminate, forearm fatigue, right? And I'll put a big X through forearm fatigue to represent the fact that when you're using a strap, when you're using wraps, whatever you want to call them, the fact that you have this around your wrist and that you can loop this thing around whatever handle you're grabbing basically makes it so that a large majority of the load that you're holding in your hand is basically just going through the back side of the strap, i.e. it's going through the back side of your wrist in the same way, let's say that if you were using lateral raise grips that were anchored on your wrist, like a cuff on your wrist, in the same way that you wouldn't have to hold that, right? You have to hold on to a lot less when you're using a strap relative to if you just, grab it with your fingers. Of course, your fingers still have to hold the strap together, but the demand on your fingers, on your wrists, and on your forearms ultimately is diminished. And so what that allows for is not just less forearm fatigue, but more specific fatigue, more load, more stimulus, more stress, more tension in the muscles you're actually trying to target, i.e. your lats on a pull down, your lats on a row, your upper back on a row, your upper back on a sort of low to high thing, whatever it happens to be, you're just taking grip out of the equation so that you can concentrate on a goal. Now, if your goal happens to be train the forearms, then would it make sense to even do a row in the first place? Why would you want to choose a rowing exercise if you were trying to train your forearms? You would just do something like a wrist curl or a wrist extension to do that, or long holds with weights, right? And so just be specific to the goal. What am I trying to do and what is most appropriate for that? We don't have to sort of mix and mash different ideas here and pretend that we need to accomplish all these different things simultaneously. No exercise can do that. No single exercise can do that. And so number two is a more underrated benefit of straps, in my opinion, and this really comes from my experience actually coaching real humans. People learn a little bit more easily how to use or how to pull with their backs rather than other stuff. So what does that mean? Well, again, if you are a trainer or a coach, or if maybe you yourself have gone through this phase of lifting, a lot of times when people pull, just whether it's a row or a pull down motion, they have a very tough time conceptualizing like what I should pull with. So here's an example. A lot of times if people are doing like a V-bar row type thing, they will pull with their hands toward their chest, right? And a lot of times this comes as a consequence of people really concentrating hard on their hands and just sort of haphazardly pulling with their hands wherever their hands can direct them, rather than in this particular case, let's say I want to train my upper lats, rather than pulling with my arms tighter to my body so that my hands stay sort of in line with the load and my forearms stay in line with the cable. And so the benefit of straps in this case is you basically eliminate that person's intent and that person's need to grip onto something for dear life. And when you do that, they actually gain an ability via this thing up here to pull with the pullers rather than just arbitrarily pulling on an implement, right? And so when you actually introduce straps and teach someone how to use straps, even if, again, even if they're not lifting that much load, even if they're beginner, even if their forearms aren't fatiguing, it can actually change specifically where they're able to distribute force and where they're able to mentally sort of pull from, such that they can accomplish the goal, not only just in that moment, in that minute more effectively, but longer term and sort of medium term, they can actually learn to pull much more easily, again, in my experience. Now, teaching people to use straps, depending on who you're working with, can be super easy or it could be a nightmare. But in my personal experience, it's been incredibly helpful because people are able to sort of loosen their grip a little bit, and they're able to assume a grip that allows them to, let's say, pull with their armpits or pull with their elbows or pull with their lats, right? They're really sort of squeezing into their lat as they pull rather than just, again, haphazardly moving with the hands. And so number 3 is basically going to be a repeat of number 1, but in a different sense. And what I mean by that is a lot of times, if you're someone who's really dedicated to lifting, which it's likely that if you're watching this at this point in this video, you are, you're going to encounter a lot of fatigue in your forearms, regardless of like how much or how little you use straps, right? We're constantly like, and people don't necessarily consider this as a training stimulus, but we're constantly like moving plates around the gym. We're constantly loading and unloading things. We're grabbing dumbbells. We're, grabbing specific portions of specific machines to stabilize ourselves, right? There's so many instances in which we are using our forearms and our hands in the gym when we might not necessarily recognize those as exercises that we're doing. That's still like stress and stimulus that is contributing to the total stress bucket of your total training volume. And so when we think about things in such a tight, isolated vacuum of this is an exercise and this is not, we potentially neglect or forget about the fact that we're constantly using our hands and our forearms. And especially if you're someone who in their daily work, their daily life is, let's say, like a manual labor, let's say you work construction or you're in moving, you're constantly grabbing stuff, using straps can have a tremendous benefit in decreasing the amount of total stress through the forearm, through the hand, and then potentially through the elbow, right? So if you're someone who has elbow issues and you're constantly gripping things, muscles of the forearm cross the elbow, and so they put stress and force across the elbow joint. That can be appropriate or inappropriate depending on specifically where you are. But if you're someone who, let's say, has diagnosed themselves unofficially as having golfer's elbow, tennis elbow, or something like that, using straps and taking stress off of the elbow, the forearm, and the wrist, again, considering all the different stressors you're encountering and not just isolated exercises, that can be something hugely beneficial. And that can then be something that can allow you to do this and repeat this cycle more and more and more. So you decrease the stress through the forearms and you actually increase your ability to handle more volume on the tasks that you want to, even something like curls or extensions, right? Biceps, triceps training that seems sort of completely unrelated. But again, if we're thinking on a more specific anatomical perspective, taking stress away from this one area allows us to potentially put more stress, if it's appropriate, into this other bucket. So I'm not saying, again, that you need straps, that you need to use them on all pulling exercises. There are a variety of instances in which you probably wouldn't. For example, like a reverse cable fly, like for your rear delts, doesn't seem to make too much sense that you would need to use straps for that. Or something like, you're doing a really strict cable row where you're pausing in the short position. You're probably not using substantial loads that you might in something like a double arm pull down. Or there are many instances in which you probably wouldn't need to use straps. But again, if any of these things seem like they could potentially benefit you, or if you're struggling with pulling, learning to pull, or taking stress away from areas that may be problematic, straps are something that could be hugely beneficial for you. And guess what? If you're someone who is still at this particular point in the video stuck to the idea that like you must not use straps, then good for you. But many people, I think, would prefer to think a little bit more we'll say in terms of the details of these different things and when these things can be useful, because ultimately anything that we use, touch, grab in the gym is a tool, and ultimately our job as people who are thinking about resistance training on a deeper level is just to identify, hey, what tools are more appropriate for what scenarios? And this thing happens to be a great tool for all these reasons.